I was standing at the kitchen sink when I finally asked the question that had been resting on my chest for weeks. The late afternoon light spilled through the window, turning the dust in the air into something almost golden. My hands were busy rinsing a cup, but my mind was elsewhere. On my son, on the plans he'd mentioned vaguely, on the invitations I hadn't seen. I tried to sound casual, almost light, when I said, "So, when is the wedding?" There was a pause, not the kind where someone is thinking about dates or venues, but the kind that makes the air feel heavier. When I turned around, my daughter-in-law was standing by the table, her fingers wrapped tightly around her phone. She didn't meet my eyes right away. Then, in a voice so soft, it almost blended into the hum of the refrigerator, she said, "We got married yesterday." For a moment, the world felt like it tilted just slightly off balance. Yesterday. The word echoed in my mind. Yesterday meant without me, without family, without the noise and color I'd always imagined. I forced a smile, because that's what you do when you don't want your confusion to turn into hurt. "Oh," I said, "yesterday." I placed the cup down carefully, afraid that if I didn't, my hands might shake. I had raised my son alone after his father passed away, and in all those years, I'd learned how to be strong quietly. Still, that strength wavered now. I thought of the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, the teenager who pretended not to care, but always waited for me before going to sleep. I thought I'd be there for this moment too. Instead, I was hearing about it after the fact, like news from a distant place. My daughter-in-law finally looked up, and I saw something in her eyes that surprised me. Fear. Not guilt exactly, but something close to it. "I hope you're not upset," she said quickly. "We didn't plan it this way at first." I nodded again, still trying to understand. "Why so suddenly?" I asked, keeping my voice gentle. She took a deep breath and sat down. "Because sometimes life doesn't wait for perfect plans," she said. "And because love doesn't always come with an invitation list." Her words stayed with me, even as I smiled and told her I was happy for them. But after she left the room, I sat alone at the table for a long time. Memories came rushing in. My own wedding, small and imperfect, my husband's laugh, the way he'd squeezed my hand and whispered that as long as we had each other, we'd be fine. We hadn't had much, but we'd had love, and that had carried us through years of struggle. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment, wondering what I'd missed. Had I been too busy? Too distant? Had my son felt he couldn't come to me? Questions turned over and over in my mind, until they began to ache. Yet beneath the hurt, there was another feeling, quieter but persistent, a sense that there was more to this story than I knew. The next morning, my son came by early. He looked nervous, the way he used to before exams or big decisions. He hugged me longer than usual, and I felt the familiar comfort of his presence. "Mom," he said, pulling back, "I know you probably have questions." I gestured for him to sit. "I do," I admitted. "But more than that, I want to understand." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "We didn't want to hurt you," he said. "It wasn't about excluding anyone. It was about timing." He told me then about the months they'd been living with uncertainty, about his wife's mother, who was ill and lived in another state, about the medical bills, the long nights, the fear that tomorrow might bring news they weren't ready to hear. They'd planned a wedding, yes, but every plan felt fragile, like it could shatter with one phone call. So when they realized they wanted to face whatever came next as a family, they chose to do it quietly, simply, without delay. "We got married at the courthouse," he said, "just us and a judge. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right." As he spoke, something in my chest softened. The picture I'd painted in my mind, of secrecy, of distance, began to fade. In its place was a story of two young people choosing each other in the midst of uncertainty, choosing commitment over celebration, meaning over appearance. "I should have told you sooner," he said, his voice thick. "I was afraid you'd feel left out." I reached across the table and took his hand. "I did feel surprised," I said honestly, "and maybe a little sad. But I'm more glad that you told me now and that you trusted me with the truth." That afternoon, I found myself thinking about kindness, not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet kind that asks us to set aside our expectations. I realized how often we hold on to images of how things should be, and how easily those images can blind us to what truly matters. A few days later, my daughter-in-law came over again. This time, she looked even more anxious than before. She brought a small box with her, holding it like it was something fragile. "I wanted to give you this," she said, placing it in my hands. Inside was a simple photograph, printed on plain paper. It showed her and my son, standing outside the courthouse, sunlight on their faces, hands intertwined. There were no decorations, no crowd, but the joy in their expressions was undeniable. Tucked behind the photo was a note, written in careful handwriting. It thanked me for raising the man she loved. It thanked me for my patience, for my strength, for the values I'd passed on without ever realizing it. Tears blurred my vision as I read. In that moment, the disappointment I'd carried melted into something warmer, something deeper. I saw that I hadn't been excluded from their love. I was part of its foundation. "I was scared you'd be angry," she admitted softly. I shook my head. "I was surprised," I said, "but I'm proud of you both." Her shoulders relaxed, and she smiled. A real smile this time, unguarded. We sat together for a while, talking about ordinary things. And in that quiet conversation, a bridge formed between us, built not on tradition or ceremony, but on honesty and understanding. Weeks passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. They visited often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to talk. One evening, as we were washing dishes together, my daughter-in-law mentioned wanting to have a small gathering someday. "Not a wedding," she said, "just a celebration, for family." I realized then how much my perspective had changed. Once I might have insisted on doing things a certain way, on reclaiming what I thought I'd missed. Instead, I felt only gratitude for the chance to move forward, together. The gathering happened months later, in my backyard. It was simple. A few strings of lights, homemade food, laughter carried on the evening air. There were no formal speeches, no rigid schedule, just people sharing stories, memories, and hope. At one point, my son raised a glass and thanked everyone for being there. He thanked me especially. You're teaching him that love is something you show every day, not something you save for special occasions. As I looked around, I felt a quiet pride. Not because things had gone according to plan, but because they hadn't. And yet, they'd turned out beautifully. That night, after everyone had left, I sat alone under the fading lights. I thought about how easily I could have let that first moment define everything. How a single sentence, "We got married yesterday," could have become a wall instead of a doorway. Instead, It had led me to a deeper understanding of compassion. It reminded me that the most meaningful acts of love are often the simplest ones, carried out without applause. Life, I realized, rarely unfolds the way we imagine. But when we choose kindness over judgment, openness over expectation, we give ourselves the chance to be part of something richer than any perfect plan. And as I turned off the lights and went inside, my heart felt lighter. Not because I had all the answers, but because I had learned something far more important. That love doesn't need permission, and family doesn't depend on ceremonies. It depends on the willingness to listen, to forgive, and to grow together.